Good morning, our dear students. So let's get to the third lecture, feeding in Benthos. In Benthos, there are basically two major forms of feeding. It's either they feed on things that are deposited at the bottom, or they feed on things that are suspended in the water column. So those ones that feed on the things that are deposited at the bottom are called the deposit feeders. Those ones that feed on food material that are in the water column are called suspension feeders. These are the two major. Other ones are incorporated into one or two of the aforementioned. So for the deposit feeders, they feed on grains, microbial organisms, generally on things that are at the bottom. Remember I said at the bottom. Okay, so when we say at the bottom, it can be in the bottom or on the bottom. So based on that, we have two major forms: the head down deposit feeders that feed within the sediment, things inside the sediment, food particles inside the sediment. And why are they called head down deposit feeder? Their heads are down, buried inside the sediment, and then their anus is pushed out where they will defecate as they feed. Okay. Then we also have the surface browsers. Those ones feed on food materials that are on the sediments, not in the sediment, but on the sediment. All right. So whichever way the activity of these feeding organisms, these feeding benthos, accelerate the microbial degradation of the sediment. What are the food sources? The food sources for the benthos, that is the sources of their food, can be from riverine and sewage inputs. It can be from drifting microbial debris. It can also be from direct sedimentation of phytoplankton and cystine that have that are dead and then settling down from the overlying water. Full selectivity in the benthos. The bulk feeders don't select. Okay, they don't select. But there are other ones that select. There are those ones that select. Let's see examples of deposit feeders. You have the surface tentacle feeding polychaetes. You have the tentacle feeding bivalve. You have the surface siphonate feeding bivalve. You have the deep feeding polychaetes. You have the surface feeding amphipod, and you have the deep feeding polychaetes. Now, if you look at it, it's even easy to classify. For example, those ones that have surface attached to them are likely to be surface browsers. Okay, those ones that have deep feeding attached to them are deep feeders. They are head down deep feeders. Okay. Now, talking about selectivity, the suspension feeders are actually selective feeders. Okay. But they can be passive or active. The active suspension feeders, they go about looking for food, looking for prey in the water column, and then getting them. Okay, and that means that they are active. Unlike the other one that are passive, they just stay at the water column, position themselves in the direction of the current flow, and then food materials flow in and get ingested. Trophic interaction between the suspension feeders. There are interaction between the suspension feeders and the deposit feeders. Okay. When organisms feed at the bottom, the deposit feeders, they do a lot of things. For example, they they bioturbate the water. And what they call bioturbation by feeding. And by doing that, they do what we call sediment mixing. Okay, sediments are resuspended into the water column. Okay, now as they do this, and that's just in the process of the feeding. As they do this, these activities also hamper the feeding process of the suspension feeders. For example, if they bioturbate the water, what will happen is that sediments are resuspended, and the suspension feeders that have their larvae in the water column, some of which are even smaller than the sediment that are being resuspended. So what happens here is that the sediment, as they will ultimately settle down, will drag the larvae, okay, and bury them as they settle on the bottom. Okay, they also constitute some another form of nuisance also, because the sediment that is being suspended can go and clog the cilia or even the gills of the suspension feeders, thereby killing them and then burying them as well. So this how they affect negatively. This is how the feeding mechanism in the in the in the deposit feeders affect negatively the feeding and the lifestyle and even the life of the suspension feeders. Now, in a way of paying back, as it were, the suspension feeder can also, if they are in large mass, can also form a seal, form a seal and collect everything that is coming from the water column, from upper part of the water column. And if they succeed in collecting whatever comes, from the upper water column, it means the implication is that nothing gets down to the deposit feeders. And then the deposit feeders are starved. Okay, I normally use this scenario of Daniel's prayer. When Daniel prayed and God heard his prayer, sent the answers. The angel that were bringing the answers were intercepted. Okay, they were intercepted, and then they couldn't get down to where Daniel is to release the prayer, the answer to the prayer, until a stronger angel was being deployed to disperse them. So that's exactly what happens here. The suspension feeders can intercept whatever is coming from the upper column, and thereby preventing those food from reaching the deposit feeders. So this is the type of interaction that exists. I hope we should be able to explain this. Okay, filter feeding in Benthos. Filter feeders feed on straining suspended matter and food particles from water by passing the water over a specialized filtering structure. So they have specialized. So for an organism, for a benthos to be a filter feeding, it must of necessity have evolved some filtering structures. Okay, that will make it possible for you to filter and then choose what you want to eat. Which means that filter feeders are selective feeders. Are selective feeders. But the deposit feeders are bulk feeders. And bulk feeders are non-selective feeders. Please let's take note of this. Okay. Now, how does filtration uh, uh, help in the ecosystem? Okay. How does this activity of filter feeding, okay, serve as an ecosystem function? They do that because they clarify the water, and then they serve as what we call the ecosystem engineer. All right. They control eutrophication because some particles that are coming are being taken care of in a way of feeding on them or in the way of filtering them off. Okay. All right. So there are also other forms of feeding in benthos. You have the carnivores, those ones that eat, other live or benthos or other live or organisms or, or animals, lower animals. You have the Cuspidaria, you have the Glycera, you have the Nucella, you have the Calinectis, that is the crab. All these ones are carnivores. The herbivores, you have the Nereis, Vexillosauria, you have the chitin. Chitin is also a herbivore. Okay. Then you have the cellulose feeder. Cellulose is the most complex form of, or a a complex form of carbohydrate. It might not be the most complex, but it's a higher form of carbohydrates. So some organisms also feed on uh, on the cellulose, like the teredo, which obtains nitrogen with symbiotic relationship with the NMBs. Okay, so this is the end of the lecture. Let's go through it. We might be having one or two more lectures also, and then let's prepare our questions so that by the time we by the time we have the all the lectures intact, we should be able to get our questions answered to or attended to, and then have our assessment. Thank you so